So I'd like to welcome you all to this first one in a series that we are organizing on migration and adaptation. This first one, we are very happy to have with us two speakers, Chandni Singh from IIHS in India and Amina Maharajan from ICIMOD in Nepal. And we'll introduce them properly in just a minute. But they are sort of co-eyes of a large research grant that we have. There are two projects actually called funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, and the IDRC in Canada, which are focusing on this theme of migration and adaptation in South Asia. The first is called Success or Successful Intervention Pathways for Migration as Adaptation. And the second one is Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways. And they're really looking to advance our understanding of migration, of mobility, and immobility, both as critical components of climate adaptation strategies. This is becoming a reality for millions of people in South Asia and, in fact, globally. But there is still limited understanding of how to support migration as a process of adaptation. So we are very happy to be launching the seminar series that will run through both this semester and next semester. Both these projects are 3.5 year programs, and we are at the sort of middle or towards the end of the first year of the program. So my name is Nitya Rao, and I'm a professor of gender and development at the School of Global Development at the University of East Anglia. We are a partner of this within this program, which is led by the University of Exeter, Neil Adger, who's later in our series, and also Chandni Singh of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and Amina Maharajan of ICIMOD in Nepal. Ritika Subramaniam is our postdoc working with us on this project in at UEA, along with Mark Tebbutt, who's unfortunately traveling and not here today. So I'll now like to hand over Ritika to say a little bit more and to introduce our speakers and the format of today's presentation. Thanks, Ritika.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're really thrilled to kick off our Migration and Climate Change seminar mini-series in partnership with the School of Global Development at UEA, and which is an extension, as Nitya just introduced, of the Success and CLAPS projects that we are facilitating at this point. So this series is is basically, we've got 3 seminars lined up this term, each building on the core framework we're developing around precarity, adaptation, and well-being in the context of climate change and migration. So to start off, during the autumn term, we're focusing on precarity, and we're really excited to feature 2 of our core team members and leading scholars in this area, Chandni and Amina. Before I do the formal introductions, I will just go through a few housekeeping rules to keep things running smoothly today. So we are recording this session, so just a heads up that your audio and video may be captured. During the presentations, please keep your microphones on mute to cut down on background noise. But it would, of course, be great to see your faces if you're comfortable with your camera on, but no worries if not. And feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along. I'll make sure we cover them during the Q&A. And if you'd like to jump in with a comment, just use the raise hand feature and I'll call you on to unmute. And yes, let's keep our questions brief so that we have time for everyone. With that, I'll introduce our 2 speakers. We first have Dr. Chandni Singh. Chandni is a lead researcher and faculty member at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, India. Her research focuses on climate change adaptation, rural-urban livelihoods, differential vulnerability, and internal migration. She served as a lead author for both the IPCC 6th Assessment Report on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability and the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. Chandni holds a PhD in rural livelihoods from the University of Reading in the UK and a master's in environmental science from Teddy University, India. Thank you for joining us, Chandni. We then have Dr. Amina Maharajan. Amina is a senior livelihood and migration specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, where she leads the organization's work on human mobility and migration. She also heads the Foresight and Policy Scenarios for Adaptation in Mountain Economies Initiative, which supports governments and communities in implementing proactive anticipatory measures to adapt to future changes and uncertainties. An interdisciplinary researcher and practitioner, Amina's expertise includes human mobility and migration, sustainable development, and climate adaptation in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. She's contributed to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report and has published extensively on the intersections of migration, climate change, and agriculture. Amina holds a PhD in agriculture from the University of Gießen in Germany. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll now pass on the mic to Chandni to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nitya and Ritika. It's really nice to do this. I'll just start sharing my slides. So I'm going to, as the topic for today is really thinking about migration and its and the changing context, I think, of climate change. What I'm going to be talking about is, first of all, how is labor migration panning out under climate change? And of course, there's been a lot of conversation and literature about migration being, or migrants being precarious. Under the conditions under which they move are extremely precarious. The context they enter into once they move are also precarious conditions. But I want to then stretch that a bit to talk about whether that's leading to climate change adaptation, better risk management for migrants and migrant households or not. I'll be, of course, drawing on evidence that we have started collecting under this project called CLAPS, Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways. And this is work that is drawing, I'm presenting it, but it's drawing from work done by a larger team, and I'll talk about them in the end. So just to start us off, I guess, oops, how does this? I think, just to set the context, labor migration, of course, is not new. Households have always been moving. People continue to move. And moving, whether from rural to urban areas or from rural to rural areas, has always been a key livelihood strategy for people and households, both to manage risk, but also meet their own aspirations. And if we talk about India, the context that I'll actually be, I'm most familiar with, but also presenting evidence from, we know that around, these numbers are also actually underestimates, and there are around 500 million internal migrants in the country. So it's a country on the move, and it's also a country that's urbanizing. So by 2035, almost, close to 50% of India will be in cities. And again, depending on how you define urban areas, this number actually shifts. What's also important to know that while people are on the move, a lot of labor migrants and those working in low-income jobs tend to enter places like you see in the picture, informal settlements, settlements where both livelihoods are informal and precarious, but also climate risk side streams. So the risks of heat and flooding and so on are acutely felt in some of these settlements, which often have a lack of basic services. And what's more important is, while lots of people talk about climate-driven migration, so the reality that there's something happening in agrarian settings, in rural spaces that is driving people to move from rural to urban areas, what we don't realize or appreciate as often is that risks, climate risks and hazards like floods and cyclones and droughts actually persist as people move. So it's not enough to just look at how climate change drives migration, but also look at how climate change intersects with migrants once they come into urban areas. Now coming to, I'm going to be talking really deeply about the case of Bangalore, city where I live in, and a city where this project also is doing a lot of data collection. And what we see is that Bangalore is a city of migrants. It is a city that, depending on definitions you use, 1 in 2 people are considered migrants. Of course, these are both skilled, semi-skilled, and then also migrants who are unskilled that are coming in. And the city is really being built by migrants. So, these are just a few numbers, but most sectors you look at, whether it is the IT sector for which Bangalore is famous, but also the construction sector, big infrastructure projects like airports and the metro, other kinds of sectors such as the gig economy, domestic workers, wherever you look, there are migrants that are sort of running the city. So while the city is built by migrants, Bangalore as a city is also facing extreme and growing climate risk. And I do want to mention here that it's not only climate change that is causing this risk, but also unplanned urbanization and so on. But when you've got bad urbanization and you overlay climate risks like flooding over it, it tends to get exacerbated. So just 1 or 2 weeks ago, this was some of the pictures from Bangalore. Even people in my organization, IIHS, we were barely able to get to work because of the kinds of floods we were seeing. Lots of buildings collapsed, and there was this terrible incident where 20 migrant workers were actually stuck in these collapsed buildings because of the extreme rain. And of course, this was only the past week, but earlier in the year, we've had extreme heat as well. And Bangalore is a city that, unlike North India, does not see very high temperatures. So 38 degrees, there was considered a heat wave for Bangalore. So it's a city that is seeing extremes increasing climate variability. And of course, while there's a fingerprint of climate change in all of this, it also intersects with just bad urbanization that's making the city more and more unlivable. We've also, of course, done our own assessments of how climate risk is actually intersecting with vulnerability, existing socioeconomic vulnerability in the city. And if you look at these black dots, these are informal settlements across the city that are notified. So that means recognized by the government. That's what the black dots show. The green dots really are talking about informal settlements that have very high extreme temperature. And then these blue bubbles that are sort of indicating flood risk and low-lying areas. And what you see is often, at least in these 4 boxes that I've sort of shown, is that a lot of these informal settlements are in places that are exposed to climate hazards. What we are seeing increasingly is actually hazards are also coming together. So we have incidences from our own fieldwork of seeing heat and drought coupled together as hazards, where you've got extreme heat and linked to it water scarcity and therefore extreme precarity. You've also got a story of cascading impact. So it's not that a flood happens and things then go back quite soon to normal in these informal settlements. You often have cases where livelihoods are disrupted, people are unable to even go out of their houses and so on. So there's a whole series of impacts that play out once these hazards occur. And of course, as I said earlier, climatic and non-climatic risks are sort of, closely intersecting with each other to shape overall risk. So that's really the context of the city that is seeing a lot of change, a city under flux, a lot of immigrants, increasing risk. But are labor migrants really the new precariat? And I just want to, again, through a series of pictures, show you what does labor migration into Bangalore look like, and similar cities, Kochi, another city in South India, where we are also doing work. So one of the things is low-income migrants typically enter the informal labor market. And by informal, I mean these are places where, or these are settings where there are no formal contracts in place. There's a propensity to pay people by the week or by a particular piece of work. So there is no continuity to work. A lot of people are engaged in extremely precarious jobs, things like having very long working hours, very poor, actually no safety measures, especially on construction sites, which are prone to a lot of accidents. And our partners in India also, Gram Vikas, the NGO Gram Vikas, and the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development, both of them also regularly report some of these precarious workspaces that people are in. There's negligible social protection, so no proper safety nets around things like health insurance and so on. And of course, extremely exploitative labor arrangements between the person who's hiring and the person who's working. And all of this becomes even more precarious by the fact that often labor migrants are interstate migrants. So they're moving across state borders. They don't speak the local language. They have very little bargaining power. There are very few collectives or unions for these kinds of interstate migrants. And there's therefore very little access to grievance redressal mechanisms. So as you can imagine, I guess this is a situation where work is extremely precarious. But labor migrants also live in very precarious places. So these are just, again, some visuals of the kinds of housing people live in. Of course, different types of houses based on what type of labor arrangements there are. most migrants do not hold legal titles and are constantly facing the fear of demolition, but also eviction from places. And a lot, at least initial field visits that we've been doing, there's a lot of housing material that's constructed with either material that absorbs heat or material that does not keep out the rain well. And as you can imagine, in a heating world, in a more flood-ridden city, these things really make living conditions more and more precarious. And then I mean, this is what we've been seeing recently. Bangalore, of course, as I said, is seeing a lot of disasters, a lot of extreme events. And it is in these moments of extremes that the narrative around migrants becomes particularly skewed, and this othering of migrants happens. And this is not, this has been seen in many cities across India, but in recent years, I think in India, in Bangalore also, we've been seeing things where last year, again, there was another year where we had extreme floods, and this whole idea that migrants, the coming in of migrants and the buildings that are being built for this increasing population is what is leading to flooding. So I put these just to show you that this is, on the one hand, you've got a very precarious population that's living in precarious conditions, working in precarious situations. And then you've got this broader narrative around migrants being blamed for some of the problems that just bad urbanization is actually to blame for. So that's, of course, the side of the precarity of migrants, but there's been a lot of euphoria around migration and seeing that migration leads to remittances. Migration can be seen as an adaptation strategy. And one of the questions we want to understand is, are some of these labor migrants actually adaptive or not, and to what extent? So again, just giving you a few pictures of the kinds of strategies migrants are using to cope with extreme hazards that we are seeing. In a lot of housing, which is of tin sheds, of tarpaulin material, people either have made way for ventilation, or they actually extend their little houses to have some space to sit out and get some ventilation. From other cities, we've also seen that low-income households actually put greenery over there. They'll have climbers and creepers, which also give some vegetables, but also provide some kind of shading in extreme heat. Bangalore's also particularly, I mean, it's quite common in Indian cities to have these cycles of drought and floods, which is, it's absolutely ridiculous, actually, that we're not able to save the water when it falls and then have these cycles of water scarcity and drought every summer. And Bangalore is no different. And what people tend to do is buy water, often at quite high costs. There are wonderful papers actually talking about the water mafia, the tanker mafia of Bangalore, and how that has really fueled this privatization of water. But as you can imagine, migrants, low-income households are often those who aren't able to buy water, and then they end up with waterborne diseases because of drinking water that's not potable. And then there are some schemes, whether by politicians or by the government, around water ATMs. And this has been successfully done in other cities. In Bangalore, it is not prevalent as much, but there are some examples of these. And then for floods, there are a range of things people are doing. They are raising the plinth of their floor, for example, just raising the height so flood water doesn't come in. In picture 2, you see people actually putting construction debris to sort of ensure that the space outside their homes are not, wet and water is not coming in. People also store water in periods when there's flooding, because again, there is difficulty in getting out, difficulty in buying water and accessing potable water. So these are series of things that people are actually doing autonomously. So households taking on the task of managing risk themselves. As you can see, and as I will argue, these are mainly coping strategies. They're short-term, they are reactive, they are making do in a situation that is extremely difficult. And these kinds of strategies are nowhere close to what one would call adaptation, which is a longer-term risk management process for people to actually minimize their risk overall. So this is what people are doing on the ground. And then we've got a range of state-led interventions that are also taking place. And in this project, we've just started analyzing some of these state and non-state interventions. And by interventions here, I mean all kinds of policies, whether by the national or state government, schemes, projects, any kind of non-governmental smaller initiatives that might be there. And what we did is we sort of analyzed around 94 of these across the country and in the state of Karnataka, which is where Bangalore is. And what we find, I guess, is first of all, 30 of these 94 actually target migrants, and they acknowledge that migrants are vulnerable members of the society, underserved in some ways. So that is promising. But then if we look on further, a lot of these migrant targeted interventions, 30 of these, actually also vilify migrants. And the narrative of migrants is people who might bring in crime, people who are not of the same place and therefore not to be trusted. For example, one of the interventions that's focused on providing affordable housing to migrants actively calls for having surveillance of these communities, having CCTV cameras so that no crime takes place. So you've already got that narrative of migrants as foreign, as other, and therefore someone to be watched. To me, what's also an important thing, I don't expect you to look at all these numbers, and that's why only if you can look at the numbers in that black box there, I just want to say that of the 94 interventions that we did look at, 73 of them are climate blind. This was something we were also wanting to really understand, that if we are to look at a range of policies and interventions that are actually talking about climate change or migration or both, how many of them actively mainstream climate concerns into these interventions? And 73 don't. Only 5 actually acknowledge the intersections of climate change and migration, and they tend to be focused more on housing. They tend to be so housing in terms of, you know, things like having better ventilation for migrant housing, providing fans and water and things like that during heat waves. So there's a very restricted view of how climate change and migration is really intersecting. And the other thing is also that of the 94 policies, 64 actually are migrant blind. So they are either universal schemes that target low-income households. Some of them are focused, especially the state action plans on climate change in India, which are very much focused on climate change. They tend to actually not talk about migrants as vulnerable at all. Bangalore's own climate action plan for the city currently does not, I mean, I think they acknowledge it, but they don't in any detail explain how and why. I mean, how does one make Bangalore both migrant inclusive, but also climate resilient? So there are these gaps that we see in the interventions. And so given all the autonomous strategies I spoke about earlier, like some of these, and then what we are seeing actually from more formal top-down kind of interventions, I have a couple of arguments to make, and then I'll end. The first is, if we think about, I mean, the IPCC tells us that adaptation is a process of adjustment to actual or expected climate change and its impacts. And adaptation really seeks to avoid harm or moderate harm and exploit beneficial opportunities. So it's an idea of risk reduction in a proactive manner, in a manner that's long-term, and in a manner that does not, I mean, definitely does not increase risk, but actually reduces risk for those people who are adapting. However, what we are seeing on the ground is that first, all the evidence that we are collecting right now from Bangalore, but other Indian cities as well, is that labor migrants are living and working in conditions of extreme precarity. This is driven by the conditions under which they work, the conditions under which they move, the drivers that shape their movement, and of course the conditions under which they live, their homes, the kinds of lack of services. I didn't go into that too much, but a lot of these settlements just don't have tenurial security, which means that then they don't have access to electricity, water, and so on, good roads, drainage systems, healthcare facilities, education. All of these get impacted when you are living in an informal settlement in a large Indian city. The third thing is that, of course, current risk management that we are seeing in households is coping at best. I think I always say this, that the onus of adapting should not be on the most vulnerable. And what somehow seems to happen repeatedly is that this act of adapting, we go out and try to understand whether this extremely precarious population is adapting or not. That's what lots of people ask. Are migrants adapting in cities? And I think it's not the right question, because we cannot expect people living and working in such precarious conditions to also be adapting. And that is where my last point, which is that I think there is a need for providing safety nets and social protection that is not only protective and preventive, taking from the theory built out of IDS, where they talk about adaptive social protection. I think there's a real need to be moving towards more transformative social protection. And this is not easy. This is not, I mean, I don't think we have very successful models, even in India, to expand it. To expand current social protection, to then sort of think about transformative social protection. But that is the direction one will have to go, so that we not only, first of all, we move away from interventions being migrant blind, but we also move towards interventions that are building climate resilience rather than remaining climate blind. So I will stop there. I also want to say that a lot of this work also draws on work done by Aisha, Namita, Swati, and Aditi, who are part of this project. And that's a website of our project if you're interested in knowing more. Thank you so much. And back to you, Ritika.
Thank you, Chandni. Thank you so much for an insightful presentation. I'll quickly move on to Amina, and then we'll bring in all the questions together at the end. Yeah, Amina, over to you.
Thank you, Ritika. Thank you, Nitya, for the introduction of the project earlier. Thank you, Chandni, for that detailed deep dive into Bangalore and Indian context. So what I would be doing is give you now a little more broader, the HKS Hindu Kush Himalayan context. This is where ICIMOD works. So, what Chandni said, a lot of that holds true not only for Bangalore and India, but actually in this entire region. So I don't know how many of you know about the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. It's a region that's spread over 8 countries, all the way from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Myanmar. It is also like, this is how it looks, I think, from space. It's also a space from where, 12 major Asian river systems, generate. So it's the headwater, so to say. Extremely important from biodiversity perspective. It hosts 4 global biodiversity hotspots here. When you are talking about Himalayas, people only think of pristine nature, but actually 270 million people live here. And the services, the ecosystem services, particularly water and other ecosystem services, that actually comes from this region, impacts 2.1 billion people. So this is the region where ICIMOD works, and to be sharing insights when it comes to labor migration under climate change, from the work, not only from success, but also work that ICIMOD has done previously, so that you get a broader understanding of this context. While we are talking about climate change here, when you consider HKs, we say multiple crises. Climate change is one of them, but biodiversity loss is another huge problematic factor, particularly for the poor and vulnerable people who are much more dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services than people living in Kathmandu like myself. Air pollution is a major issue, and now it's becoming one of the silent killers, major silent killers in this region, and demographic shifts. And this is where migration, comes into picture. So if I give labor migration, key facts of labor migration in HKS, there are some very common trends. And in this internal migration, which Chandni spoke about, it's across all these countries. Internal migration is actually the biggest. There is also cross-border migration in these countries, because it's also South Asia is also considered as migration hub for that region, and also international migration. And we have common destination in terms of Gulf countries and Malaysia. Across all these South Asian countries, people go there. Now, if you look at these various migration patterns here, and I've just covered the broad ones, when it comes to international migration, we have, all the countries have more or less very good regulatory and institutional mechanisms in place. But when it comes to internal migration, there is very, very limited policies really focusing on internal migration. So there is actually no comprehensive policy looking into the internal migration management in any of these countries. And if you look at migration and its impact, it's so difficult because the impact goes into various sectors, right? So it becomes very complex to understand how migration impacts other socioeconomic situations of the communities and countries. And since we are interested on climate change, what we are increasingly seeing, and there is now evidence slowly that, it's migration is always multi-driver. It's never one factor that people decide to move. It's always multi-driver, and here climate change impacts are emerging as one of those accelerators that is driving people to decide to move. Now, labor migration, the moment people talk about labor migration, mostly people think of migration and development because this is an area of work that has seen a lot of progress in this region. And migration and climate change adaptation is relatively new, so to say. And if you look into even migration and development and narratives, there is really a lot of conflicting narratives. There is no clear narrative and debate, and this debate is never ending. And this is what now you see getting similar narratives developing in climate and migration interlinkages as well. Most of the time, the moment you talk about migration, it's considered as a failure for development. So for most governments and people in governance really don't want to take migration seriously because of that notion that it's because the rural areas are not developing, that's why people are moving to urban areas, or for that matter, your country is not being able to develop, that's why international migration. And if there are positive narratives, then it's mostly through remittances. So people are talking about remittances. Now I'm based in Kathmandu, Nepal, and everybody talks highly about remittances. I think it's around 28 to 29% equivalent of GDP, the remittances. So Nepal is one of those countries where remittance plays a significant role at national scale. But then when you speak of remittances, the very next sentence people start to talk about is, okay, remittances are coming, but it's not being used productively. So this does not really lead to development. So again, that circle of migration and development comes into picture. And often, Chandni mentioned about migrants being blamed for all the problem. And if you look at in these countries, migration is also blamed for lots of social evils, particularly the institution of marriage, that it's leading to breakdown of marriages, and many other social norms and social fabric. But at least in migration and development, now there is clear evidence that, particularly in a country like Nepal, that migration has actually a positive impact on poverty reduction at national scale now, food security, access to health services, access to education in terms of not only enrollment, but also continuation of children at school, and also wealth and asset creation at household level. So these evidences are now slowly piling up. But what is very interesting is, despite these evidences, there is this dichotomy now. What Chandni mentioned, it is acknowledged. So if you look into most policies, it's there in the background that migration is an issue. It's there. So the acknowledgement is there. But the moment you talk about mainstream, forget about mainstreaming, even integrating migration and its various impacts, that's where then it goes completely quiet. And this is something in the project we are also trying to analyze and see. And again, this dichotomy of migration versus remittances. Broadly speaking, migration is considered in a negative light, something that needs to be stopped. But remittances is considered more or less in a positive light. And post-COVID, I think a lot of countries have begun to understand the significant contribution that remittances has been making, when that after COVID, for 2 years, there was not really slump in remittance receiving, but a slump in people moving. And also there is this dichotomy in internal and international migration. So the countries, when you are talking about international migration and protection of migrant workers, they would be demanding of, that safety measures, migrants protections, transfer of social protection to migrant communities. But then the moment the narrative changed to internal migration, again, everything is silent. This is actually not happening. So there is this dichotomy in how this narrative is actually evolving when it comes to migration, depending on which type of migration that we are talking about. And there are certain aspects that's actually missing in migration discourse. One of them is climate links in labor migration cycle. Often labor migration and climate, when you talk about it, there are many missing links. I'll mention about some of those links in the next slide, and also how internal and international migration is actually linked. It doesn't go in silos. Actually, there are lots of linkages that's again not really understood and discussed. Migration and adaptation, again, relatively new, only about a decade or so that this discussion has started. And it's only now that, there is more interest in this topic. And immobilities, again, when you are talking about migration, immobility is often not really talked about. And what does immobility mean for precarity or adaptive capacities of these people? So for example, for the second, internal and international. So this is a picture from Nepal. The picture above is the queue of people who were, queuing for that labor permit. Thankfully now this queue, you would not see it because now it is digitalized and decentralized. And a lot of this international migration in Nepal now has impact on this depopulation in mountain regions and people moving to more urban centers and towns, even in mountain regions. So that link is now slowly, we are beginning to see, at least anecdotally. And as I said, what are those links in labor migration? So Chandni mentioned about internal migration in India, which holds true in other cases. But let me give you an example of an international migration where most of the countries in HKH region, the migrants actually go to Gulf countries. Now, Gulf countries are also facing these impacts of labor migration, right? So, but when you are talking about international labor migration, that is the missing component. So I'm just simplifying this migration cycle into three aspects. Actually, there are more, but just for simplification. So before people move, when people are deciding to, go for international labor migration or not, climate has an impact there because most migrants actually move from rural areas, even to this international destination, particularly low-skilled and semi-skilled migrants. So they are mostly, farm-based livelihood in their origin. Either they work as farmers themselves or farm laborers. So the impact of climate change on agriculture sector plays a very important role in terms of decision to move from rural areas to international destination. And once they have reached destination, now let's not forget that in Gulf countries, they are mostly working in construction and other sectors, so completely exposed. And the temperature rises. Anyways, even in normal context, during summer, 45, 46 degrees is very normal. So with the climate change impacts, when those temperature rises, so people are actually living, and working in a context which is probably not very suitable for any human being. So that has a huge impact on the health as well as overall life of migrant workers. And this is why, again, this is something not much studies have been done, that, a significant proportion of migrant death in destination is reported as sudden death due to cardiac arrest. And there has not been further investigation and how much a role of heat has in these deaths. Similarly, accidental deaths, those are there. But then how come a very healthy, people do these health checkups before they leave? So healthy young people working there and you have sudden deaths. So, that climate angle here, again, completely missing so far. Again, when you are talking about international migration to Gulf countries, these are all contractual term limits, right? So the contracts can be 2 to 3 years. And after they complete that contract, they come back and they might or might not go. Often people go for second or third time, and this is what you call the duration of migration cycle. So there, how long or how many cycles people do and how successful they are in return and reintegrating back to their villages or new places. Again, there also climate plays a very important role, because what we found, at least in Nepal, is most of the labor migrants, they come back and they again go back to agriculture-based livelihoods, because there are very few non-farm sector opportunities in rural areas. So climate change and its impacts is going to play a very important role in that migration cycle, the length of the cycle, as well as the success of reintegration. So these are things that that has not been actually studied. So most of them, what I'm speaking about for the decision, there has been some evidences, but in destination, health, life, or death of migrants, as well as return, these are things that has not really been studied. There is lack of evidence, but definitely those climate links are there. Now, coming to this question, is it new precariat or adaptive agents migration? Now, Chandni mentioned about adaptive capacities of migrants themselves in cities, but I want to take it a little broader, because most migrants, labor migration, where one or more family members actually move, rest of the family is still at origin. This migration is not only important for the migrants, but also for the adaptive capacity of the entire households that's leaving behind, as well as the communities. So it's often migration is also a strategy where people move so that rest of the family can stay behind, right? So it's important to understand. If you bring that broader perspective, then I think, to sum up, there are a few things that would determine if migration actually pushes not only migrants but also the households to more precarious situation, or if it helps households to have better adaptive capacities. One of the major factor is governance. Now, the problem is it's acknowledged in the background that this is happening, but this is not really given space when you're talking about, Chandni mentioned about interventions, but also in policy and plans, because they are completely absent in policy. So migrants are only talked about in migration policy. Rest of the things, it's actually not there. For a country where remittance plays such an important role, almost as much as agriculture sector, even in Nepal, it's completely missing. So it's there in migration policy, it's there in 5-year plans, but other plans, it's actually completely missing. And this plays a very important role, because if you are not even considered, if a phenomenon is not even considered, then where does the protection, providing that safety nets comes into picture? Second sector of work. Now, when we are talking about migrants, I'm sure a few of us here are also migrants. Where you work matters, because you might still work in low-skilled, semi-skilled, like drivers, but if you're working at a university as a driver, then you probably have better, your job is not that precarious, right? Whereas if you're working as a taxi driver, it's much more precarious. So that informal and formal sector of work, that all matters. But unfortunately, most migrants, low and semi-skilled migrants, they work in informal sectors where the living condition, the working condition, everything then is highly precarious. So, sector of work really matters when it comes to international labor migration, because this is transnational. So here a host of other factors comes into picture: geopolitics, bilateral relation between the countries, all of that plays when it comes to how precarious the migrants are in the destination. And I think one important thing to consider is we have limited understanding of the entire system of migration. So this is a new paper that Chandni, myself, both of us are there as co-authors, and we looked into how migration intersects so many other different, aspects. And we also looked into, from different disciplines that we have research migration. This is migration research. And migration has never been looked into its complexity. We have always looked into certain aspects of it, so very siloed. We have not understood that system because of probably the complexity involved. Something that in Success we aim to, as well as in CLAPS, as our sister project, we aim to, try to understand this migration system, because unless you do that, it becomes very difficult to really drive a precarious journey to a more adaptive journey. And
Amina,
most
you
of us,
can
I think,
wind up in 1 or 2 minutes.
yeah,
We'll have
that
some
this
time
is my
for
last
questions.
slide.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this is my last slide. And I think the major mental block is this sedentary bias, because we have always thought migration as failure to development. And now, when it comes to climate context, we have again, developed this narrative as failure to adapt. That mental block, of that sedentary bias, that adaptation should be in place, development should be in place. I think that's the major bottleneck. And how do you get rid of it? Because unless you do that, it's very difficult to get away from this debate to really start moving into under what condition migration can be actually a successful adaptation and development strategy. And I think finally, this overt focus on climate-induced migration, again, as a result of this sedentary bias, the moment you are talking about climate-induced migration, people are not able to adapt, or there is limitation to adapt. That's why people move. That narrative is really not helping, because migration is so nuanced and so multifaceted. So yeah, unless we get away from this very narrowed focus, try to understand the system, we will continue on this debate of precarity or adaptive capacities. But what is now slowly evidence, there is evidence that migration can be adaptation, has that capability, that potential to build the adaptive capacities of not only migrants but also the households. But for that, these missing links has to be further understood. That's my last thing. Thank you. Over to you, Nitya and Ritika.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you so much. I think, both of you, by talking about the conflicting narratives and muddy waters, as you put it, Amina, have really opened up a lot of, I think, thought to reflect on, as well as, I think, unpack. I now invite any of our participants, if you all have any questions for our speakers. We have around 5 minutes, so, we can make the best of it. We have a question in the chat, I guess.
Yeah, that's
Kavita,
from
do you want to read
Kavita.
it loud, or should I read it from the chat? I mean, Kavita, do you want to read it for us, or?
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chandni and Amina. You demonstrated the multiplicity of climate risks really well, especially how these can kind of compound and follow each other in close proximity, such as heat and flooding. And I wondered about the types of systems that need to be in place to support migrants. And obviously, I'm asking you $1 million question, but I'd appreciate any thoughts, especially when we think about governance and how kind of patchy and sometimes both patchy and how it can also overlap at the city and regional levels. So what might better governance look like, better disaster governance look like vis-a-vis migrants? Thank you.
I can start us off and then maybe Amina. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And of course, it's difficult to answer. But again, at least there's several things that lots of places or lots of organizations are trialing out. One is that at least, again, when you have interstate migrants, often who don't speak the language where they're migrating to, a lot of these DRR, the disaster risk reduction strategies fail, or evacuation protocols that are supposed to be there don't reach people who don't speak the local language. So again, CMID, a non-governmental organization in India, has been trialing out multilingual heat advisories, where you've got heat advisories coming from the Met Department. They translate them into at least 5-6 languages so that they can reach migrants. That's one thing. But also doing some capacity building with local level government officials, really, at least now again in the urban, if I think about urban settings, in urban local bodies, having some kind of first profiling of migrant settlements. So where are your migrants? Then when you have flood risk plans and maps being built, you sort of overlay migrant settlements there so that you know where do you have to go in times of evacuation, immediate relief. So those are just some things that come to mind, but of course there's a lot more that needs to be done around. This is really the the big challenge and the big question. And what we want to do in these projects is sort of develop metrics of what does successful adaptation look like for migrant settlements, which is obviously not an easy thing to do.
Thank you, Kavita. Just building on Chandni's response, it's $1 million question, but we are actually trying to, on the success and claps, we are actually trying to see what exactly needs to be done. Because I think the first thing is going from acknowledgement to at least, integrating that in urban context, because of migration, you have that population composition changes. Even acknowledging that and start to think becomes very important. So under this project, what we are now trying to encourage the local governments at least is that, start to get a hang of in urban areas, where are those migrant population, where they are coming from, and in rural areas where your people are moving. Because you need to provide, not, let's get out of that administrative boundary. And if it is your constituent outside your administrative boundary, you still can provide those services. What are those ways to do it? And this is where, that it's complex, but this is where you call this origin and destination. They have to come together, because that's the only way that we can, start to, because one government looking at only one place becomes very difficult. And this is where that comprehensive thinking at national level becomes important, where the origin is there, destination is there. How do you bring that together? Can we start keeping data of people, because what we realize is in mountain, a lot of informality. So people know, but they just don't put it on paper. And that becomes critically important. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. Nitya, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Ritika. Thanks, both of you, Chandni and Amina. I think I just had listening to your last slide, Amina, this question came to my mind that you said that a lot of the discourse is actually focusing on climate-induced migration. And I think, Chandni, before you suggested that actually climate is not really visible in the discourse on migration. So I think that sort of poses to me an interesting contrast. And I'd really like both your comments. I think, Chandni, also because you were sort of involved with the IPCC report as well, which looked at climate change and migration. And then your own work shows that, the policies in India are not really looking, or the climate action plans are not really looking at migration. And I think Amina had an opposite kind of insight from the HKH region. So any comments that you have on this sort of, I guess it shows the complexity, but also the variation across the region. So any comments that you have, either from a more local or a broader perspective, would be very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a nice point you picked up, Nitya. I have 2 points to make. One is that there's too much emphasis on how many people are moving. And I keep saying this in various fora. People might be, at least the project team must be quite exhausted of hearing me say this. But this focus on quantifying how many people are migrating because of climate change is an important thing to do, but it is taking away attention from the larger problem, which I feel is that we need to understand what are the conditions under which people are moving and what are they moving into. So this, how many people are climate driven, climate induced, disaster displaced, that to me is not an intellectually as important. And actually policy, if you think of the policy relevance, it's not as important a question. What I was trying to get at actually is that when we do have policies and interventions around protecting migrants, providing them safety nets, there is no understanding that climate change is going to undermine some of these safety nets. So we have to make these safety nets adaptive. So it's that is the climate blindness that is there, and not so much. So it's actually, I think the point Amina was making is that let's not, the climate driven thing, which I totally agree with her. So that's just a difference. And that is what is challenging. How do you provide effective social protection in a climate changed world? This is a tough question. And I don't think, we were trying to look for examples of how it's done, even across the world. And I think that is not as simple as, it's difficult. It requires a lot of money. It requires different kinds of expertise.
Actually, not only complex, this is where the dichotomy and paradox actually is. The moment you talk about climate and migration, people are talking about climate-induced migration, which short, in a nutshell, that comes down to displacement. Huh? But whereas mobility and migration is so broad, so you can't bring with just one relating to climate. But the moment you talk about labor migration, then climate becomes blind. There is no climate there. But you bring climate, it becomes displacement. So this is what that paradox. I think we are not talking about two different points similarly, and this overt focus on climate as the only driver on migration, that is actually not helpful, because that then narrows down the entire discourse so focused on displacement alone. Whereas, and also it takes away from this is where again that disconnect between policy, planned adaptation and autonomous adaptation. Now, recently, National Statistical Office and UNDP Nepal have come up with a report on this climate change impact and how people are coping into it. For non-farm sector, 23 or 29%, I actually forgot, and this is a representative survey, said that they are using seasonal internal migration as an adaptation and coping to the climate change impacts, right? But this is never taken. This was like for the first time that that picture came. Otherwise, in a national go to any event, the moment you talk about climate, people talk about displacement. But that is named as climate-induced migration. And that's what I meant, that we need to go away. Let's bring that complexities. Reality is always complex. Let's not oversimplify and create a mess. So having that climate angle into the labor migration discourse becomes very important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have very little time, but I'll request Amar to ask your question first, and then we have a question in the chat as well. Let's see if we can combine it. Amar? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, if not, I think until then, would Chandni or Amina want to take the question that we have in the chat from Arhan? The point about heterogeneity of migrants is really important. Many of the challenges poor migrants face are also faced by other vulnerable people. Are there lessons from pro-poor interventions that may be relevant for migrants? Either of you?
This is an
Yeah, I think it is. Actually, you can, there are lots of lessons that can be learned from poor interventions. And I think some probably that's something Chandni can add on. For instance, like programs focused on social safety nets in India are now slowly, again, considering migrants. Some of those progress happened post-COVID. After all that visuals of migrants walking home, I think COVID has brought some positive, aspects to migrants here. And again, during one of our scoping visits to a local municipality, they mentioned that during COVID, the government came up with these relief packages, and most native people said that we actually don't want it. We are fine. And those packages, the local governments realized that it's the migrant community which actually needed it. They were in a dilemma, do we give it or not? They said not really our constituents, but they ended up a decision saying that, okay, we are going to support anyways, because they are at the end citizens and they need that support, right? And during COVID, that flexibility was given. So I think there are some very good learnings to be learned from that. Chandni, you want?
Yeah, just very quickly, I know, Ritika, we're out of time. So I just want to say, yes, I think there are lots of things we can learn from, especially again around safety nets. And a lot of people have been, for a long time campaigning for safety nets to be wide enough so that they include migrants. So the One Nation, One Ration card scheme in India is one of them, where you've got a public distribution system that gives food to, rations to provide food security or meets food security goals. And that has now become portable so that you can move across states and get that. Of course, there are lots of challenges with that. It has not worked as well. The signing up people for that scheme hasn't worked as well as it should have. But I think we have to be a little careful about just taking lessons from pro-poor schemes, only because, as Amina said earlier, they have a sedentary bias. So there is an inherent understanding that poor people are staying in place. But as we know, migrants are moving, households are stretched across locations. And how do we deal with that mobility when we are thinking about social protection? So I think if we are to expand the idea of adaptive social protection, it's climate adaptive, but it's also migrant sensitive, migrant inclusive, I guess. That would be adaptive in my mind.
Yeah.
Stop
On that
here.
note, thank you so much, Chandni and Amina, for your insightful presentations. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be back in 3 weeks and we look forward to seeing everyone here. So yeah, thank you so much once again.